In the historic epic, The Last Samurai by Tom Cruise, an American officer travels to Japan to train imperial soldiers in the use of modern weapons and tactics. As a result, he saw a struggle between the emperor, who wanted to modernize Japan, and the samurai, who sought to preserve the spirit of the country. He decides to join the latter, although the Japanese have always been suspicious of outsiders, foreigners. The film's incredible plot is based on true events, and in this episode of Histographics, we're going to tell you about how the French army officer Jules Brunet ended up in Japan and fought on the side of the samurai. Until the middle of the 19th century, Japan had a closed-door policy. The feudal government, the Tokugawa shogunate, for many centuries forbade citizens to leave the country and refused to let foreigners in. Outsiders brought with them goods and weapons from all over the world, because of which the traditional values. To prevent this, the authorities left a small island in the harbor of Nagasaki for foreigners to trade, where ships from China and Holland sailed. The Japanese were unaware of their hopeless lag behind other countries until July 14, 1853. On that day, American warships, led by Matthew Perry, arrived in Yokosuka Harbor. The newest steamers, with coal smoke pouring out of the chimneys, impressed the Japanese so much that they called them black ships, Karafune. The military squadron became a decisive factor in the trade negotiations between Japan and the United States. In 1854, under the threat of shelling the city, Perry forced the ruler of Japan to sign the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, marking the beginning of diplomatic relations. Realizing how critical the country was, Emperor Meiji decided to carry out a series of political, military, and socio-economic reforms. First of all, he opened trade and began to encourage cultural exchange so that Japan could catch up with the world community. In the history textbooks, this time was named as the Meiji Restoration, which turned the medieval state into one of the leading countries in the world. Just a few years later, the Japanese entered the war with the powerful Russian Empire and won a victory, but that will be later. But for now, in the midst of reforms, the emperor had to fight with his own people. The fact is that, at that time, there was a dual power in Japan. On the one hand, Emperor Meiji and influential feudal lords sought to modernize the country and revive the power of the emperor, whose powers were purely formal, like the English queen. On the other hand, the Tokugawa shogunate, consisting of samurai, had ruled the country de facto since 1192. Samurai, who made up 10% of the population, relied on agriculture. They ruled harshly, considering themselves an elite caste created only for war. The samurai did not know how to do anything else, and it was not economically profitable to maintain such a large army in peacetime. Shogun Yoshinobu, the first person in the state, also understood the need for reform. He even managed to take the first steps in this area, where the opposition forced him to transfer all power to the emperor. The shogun hoped that the emperor would make him an advisor and retain powers comparable to that of the prime minister. However, then the unexpected happened. The emperor issued a decree on the dissolution of the shogunate. By this order, he centralized power, taking away powers from local feudal lords, forbade samurai to carry weapons, canceled their pension, deprived them of all ranks and titles. Yoshinobu opposed this decision and openly declared war on the emperor in 1868. It is at this moment that our hero appears, a veteran of the French army, Jules Brunet. A recognized expert in the field of artillery, he first went to war during the French intervention in Mexico in 1862 to 1867, where he received the Order of the Legion of Honor, Légion d'Honneur, the highest military award in France. In 1867, Emperor Meiji ordered the purchase of modern weapons from the West and the recruitment of officers from experienced warring countries to train the army. The emperor's entourage was guided by the experience of the United States and Great Britain, while the shogunate worked closely with France. Soon ships with new weapons arrived in Japan, and with them military advisors. Brunet was in their group. When the Civil War broke out, Brunet and Captain André Cazeneuve accompanied the shogun on his march to the capital, Kyoto. On January 27, 1868, an army of 15,000 samurai reached the southern outskirts of the city. They wanted to deliver a letter to the emperor demanding the cancellation of his decision to dissolve the shogunate and return their titles and lands. In case of refusal, the rebels intended to seize power. However, they were not allowed to go further to the capital, and the troops of the principalities opposed to the shogunate, Satsuma and Chosu, who were guarding the city, opened fire. The Battle of Toba Fushimi began. the first conflict of the Boshin War, the War of the Year of the Dragon. Although the shogun's forces outnumbered the government forces by 3 times, they had one critical flaw: their weapons. The rebels were a hastily assembled army. Many of the soldiers had only swords and spears at their disposal, inherited from their ancestors, while the army of the emperor had modern weapons, rifles, howitzers, and even a Gatling gun, which produced 200 rounds per minute. The battle lasted for 3 days and ended with the complete defeat of the rebels. Many feudal lords, seeing the senselessness of resistance, went over to the side of the emperor. Brunet and the shogunate fleet commander, Enomoto Takiki, fled north to the capital of Edo, present-day Tokyo. With the beginning of the confrontation, foreign states, including France, vowed to remain neutral in the conflict. Emperor Meiji ordered the French advisors to leave the country as they were training the troops of the shogunate, his enemy. Most of the officers went to France, but Brunet decided to stay and fight on the side of the Tokugawa. Other advisors followed his example: Fortin, Marlin, Cazeneuve, Bouffet. The officers were left without government support in a country engulfed in civil war. The only explanation for this decision can be found in a letter that Brunet sent directly to Emperor Napoleon III. Brunet understood that at home, he would be considered a madman and a traitor, so he wrote, "I want to stay in order to continue in new conditions. Our military mission in the shogunate is beneficial to both France and Japan. Soon there will be a reaction to the actions of the emperor. The feudal lords offered me to become their advisor. I agreed, because with the help of 1,000 Japanese officers I trained, I can lead an army of 50,000. The support of France's allies and the desire to create a new army is a good explanation for the emperor. But apparently Brunet's true motives were different. Most likely, he stayed because he was impressed by the spirit of the Tokugawa samurai and considered it his duty to help them. At the Battle of Edo, the emperor's forces were victorious again, thanks in part to the shogun Yoshinobu's decision to obey the ruler. He surrendered the city, and only scattered rebel groups continued to resist. Despite this, Admiral Taiki refused to surrender and headed north to Aizu, hoping to rally the local samurai. There, the nucleus of the so-called Northern Coalition of Feudal Lords was formed, which joined the remaining leaders of the shogunate and continued the struggle against the emperor. However, the advantage was too great. The rebels did not have enough modern weapons to give a decent rebuff. By November 1868, they suffered another defeat. Several thousand soldiers, with the rest of the fleet, fled north to the island of Hokkaido. Here, the rebels proclaimed the creation of the Republic of Izo. Takeaki made a last attempt to negotiate with the emperor and asked him to allow the Republic to develop the island and maintain the samurai traditions. But his request was rejected. At that moment, it became obvious that the French officer had chosen the losing side, but he was not going to retreat. Brunet helped organize the defense. He built defensive positions around the fortress, and from scattered detachments, he created a combat-ready army in the French manner. The officer himself became deputy commander-in-chief, and each brigade was commanded by his colleagues. The last battle of the Boshin War took place in the port city of Hakodate. The battle lasted from December 1868 to June 1869. For half a year, 3,000 Tokugawa rebels held back the onslaught of 7,000 imperial soldiers. Brunet and his subordinates fought desperately, but this did not save them. The French advisors found themselves in a terrible position. Fortunately, a French warship was stationed near Hokkaido, which brought Brunet and his comrades to Saigon, the Vietnamese colony of France. And from there, they returned to their homeland. Although the Japanese government demanded punishment for Brunet, France could not satisfy the demand, as the public opinion was on the officer's side. Instead of being imprisoned, Brunet was reinstated in the army and fought in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. During the siege of Metz, Brunet was captured, but was soon released and even managed to take part in the suppression of the Paris Commune. Meanwhile, his colleague Enomoto Takeaki was pardoned and rose to the rank of Vice Admiral of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He used his influence not only to get the Japanese government to pardon Brunet, but to present him with several awards, including the prestigious Order of the Rising Sun. Until his death in 1911, Jules Brunet had an incredibly successful military career. From a simple officer, he rose to the rank of Chief of Staff, but he went down in history as the prototype of the protagonist from The Last Samurai. There are many similarities between him and the character of Tom Cruise. Both are foreign advisors training Japanese troops in the use of modern weapons, and both were on the losing side. But in the film adaptation, a lot is embellished. In the film, the hero trained government troops and joined the samurai only after he became their hostage. Samurai are shown on the screen as warriors stuck in the Middle Ages, especially in contrast to the modernized soldiers of the emperor. At the same time, the rebels, with the help of only swords and bows, skillfully deal with an armed but inexperienced army. However, in reality, the Takamori rebels wore Western-style uniforms, and only a few warriors wore traditional armor in principle. Also, thanks to Brunet and advisors, the rebels actively used modern weapons. There were more than 60 artillery pieces. The events of the film take place at the time when the Meiji Restoration was already in full swing and the Satsuma Rebellion took place, the last major samurai performance. The leader of the uprising was Saigo Takamori, who was described by his contemporaries as an honest and just samurai. He became the prototype for the rebellious warrior Katsumoto. The film culminates in the final battle, where Brunet and Katsumoto, along with the remaining fighters, launch a desperate attack. The battle on the screen quite accurately conveyed the Battle of Shirayama, which really ended in the defeat and death of the samurai. Only it happened in 1877, when the real Brunet left Japan long ago. Interestingly, in the film, the rebels are depicted as the embodiment of good, noble keepers of ancient traditions, and the emperor's supporters look like openly evil capitalists who are only interested in profit. The real background of the confrontation was completely different. The emperor's political advisors in the past were samurai who voluntarily gave up their privileges in order to follow their chosen course. They believed that only development would save Japan. The rebels also supported the idea of, although it should be recognized that many samurai fought not so much for traditional values, Brunet risked his career and life by refusing to abandon the army he had trained. He did not care that the samurai shared very different cultural values. He showed true nobility and deserved to be immortalized in films. Or do you have a different opinion on this matter? Leave your thoughts in the comments, like and don't forget to share the video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel.